Under the terms of the 1954 Geneva Protocols, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to the north, supported by China and Russia. To the south was the Republic of Vietnam, supported by the United States. It was as if the Korean problem of the late 40s had been transplanted to Indochina. President Eisenhower recognized the elected regime of the Republic of Vietnam and promised support. He accepted the domino theory that all countries of Southeast Asia would fall one by one to the North Vietnamese if they were not checked. The United States decided to prevent the dominoes from toppling by shoring up the South Vietnamese with military equipment and training. On October 11, 1961, President Kennedy authorized the deployment of an element of the USAF Jungle Gym Combat Training Squadron to South Vietnam under the code name Farmgate. The nominal task was to train and equip the Vietnamese Air Force. The Vietnamese Air Force started with 6 squadrons and 97 ill-maintained planes in 1962. Under Farmgate, it grew to an effective force of 14 squadrons and 285 planes in 1965. But it was not enough, and never would be enough. The advisory phase mutated into direct USAF involvement. America found itself at war. In the spring of 1965, Viet Cong forces increased their activity. A mortar attack on Bien Hoa Air Base destroyed 5 Martin B-57s. There was an attack on the American embassy in Saigon. The U.S. reaction to Viet Cong activity was a decision to use USAF tactical air power directly. This would include bombing infiltration trails in Laos and targets in North Vietnam. The Air Force recommended that if America was forced into a contest with North Vietnam, there was a quick solution: a decisive bombing attack against 94 major industrial targets would wipe out North Vietnam's war-making capability. At that time, North Vietnam had yet to build its sophisticated defense network of surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft batteries, and MiG interceptors. The only possible way for the United States to have lost in Vietnam was to commit huge land forces. The only way it could have won was with an overwhelming airstrike.
And with your permission, therefore, I'd like to tell you something.
But by the early 60s, a whiz-kid style of micromanagement had been thrust upon the Pentagon by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara was a master of quantitative analysis, the king of the number crunchers. He could recall statistics and destroy any briefer whose information was wrong.
10 of the types of planes which are operating off our carriers today in the South China Sea, because it was then that
He believed that military equipment could be procured on the basis of statistical analysis. This belief was not shared by military professionals. McNamara failed to understand that the corporate concept of a bottom line cannot be translated into the life or death considerations of military requirements. This failure would have a profound effect on America's ability to win the war.
How would they have ever won World War II if they'd had direction like that? It was, McNamara set the Air Force back 15 years, maybe 30, I don't know.
By 1964, events all over the world could be monitored in real time in Washington, D.C. It became possible for the Commander-in-Chief to issue orders directly to the field on a day-to-day basis. It was a tempting prospect for most leaders. To Lyndon Johnson, it was irresistible. In World War II in Korea, the government had set broad policies for the military to fulfill in the conduct of military operations. But in Vietnam, the government would direct operations on a daily basis. It would prescribe targets and times of attack. It would even select the ordnance to be used. Communications were rapid, but orders passed from the White House would have to pass through the various headquarters: the Pentagon, 13th Air Force in Hawaii, 7th Air Force in Saigon. By the time the orders reached the battlefield, the real situation could be completely altered, often because of leaks to the Viet Cong. The results were wasted sorties and vicious ambushes. The Department of Defense and the White House established an intricate and variable set of rules of engagement. These rules subjected military action to short-term political considerations. They also used the incredible policy of graduated response, warfare by measured escalation, designed to correspond nicely to provocations. In the comfort of Washington offices, it was determined that air operations were to deliver a political message instead of devastating damage. The war would be played by signals. It would fall to the men and women of all services to take up the slack of abject failure of civil and military leadership. They would do the best possible job under the worst conditions, and they would find themselves reviled by the public for doing their duty.
But for whatever reason, we were there. And we had American young men there, many of which were conscriptees, 55,000 of whom gave their lives. They risked everything they had and they lost it. And I read in Mr. McNamara's book that he said, the President and I got many, many recommendations from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of which had a paragraph about the risks involved. And in every one of them, there was the risk of intervention, the risk of attack, the risk of exploiting, the risk of that and the other. And so McNamara said, the President and I had already agreed that we weren't going to take those risks. You can't persist long in asking your young men, and now your young women, to risk everything they have in war if the nation that's putting them in that position isn't willing to share their risks.